The summer I turned 53, the Forest Service asked me to do something I'd never been asked to do before. They wanted me to reopen a road. Not build one, not survey one, not maintain one. Reopen one. Forest Development Road, 1141. 17 miles of gravel and packed earth threading through the Nantahala National Forest in western North Carolina, connecting the town of Aquone to a dead-end turnaround near the headwaters of Piercy Creek. The road had been gated and closed in June of 1974. 30 years later, in the spring of 2004, someone in the regional office in Atlanta decided it was time to assess whether 1141 should be restored to public access, decommissioned permanently, or converted to a maintained trail. On paper, it was simple. Drive the road's length on an ATV. Document structural conditions. Note drainage failures. Assess bridge integrity. Flag hazard trees, and file a recommendation. 2 weeks of fieldwork. Standard infrastructure review. What made it unusual was why the road had been closed in the first place. The official closure order cited structural degradation and public safety concerns. That was the language on the gate sign, and that was the language in the 1974 filing I pulled from the district archive before heading out. But the filing was thin, 2 pages where most closure orders ran 8 to 12. No engineering assessment, no photographs, no culvert inventory, no mention of which specific structures had failed or what hazards had been identified. Just a 1-paragraph recommendation signed by the district ranger at the time, a man named P.T.R. Galt, and a regional forester's approval stamp dated 6 days later. 6 days. I'd processed road closures myself. The fastest I'd ever seen one move from recommendation to approval was 11 weeks. If you're the kind of person who finds yourself listening to stories like these on a regular basis, you might consider subscribing and staying along for the ride. I've got no shortage of things worth telling. I asked around before I left. The current district ranger, a woman named Donna Vasquez, had been in the position for 3 years. She'd inherited the 1141 closure from 4 predecessors and had never questioned it. She told me the road had simply always been closed, as far as anyone in the office remembered. When I asked if she knew why Galt had recommended the closure, she gave me a look I recognize the look someone gives you when they realize they've never actually thought about something they assumed they understood. "The paperwork says structural degradation," she said. "It does." "Then that's why." I let it go. But I'd been reading closure orders for 30 years by then, and the Galt filing didn't read like a structural assessment. It read like someone trying to close a road as fast as the system would let him, using the fewest words that would survive a file review. I left Asheville on a Monday in early May. The dogwoods were still blooming along the Blue Ridge Parkway, and the ridge lines had that bright, unfinished green that only lasts a few weeks in the southern Appalachians before the canopy darkens and fills in. I'd worked in the Nantahala twice before, both times on search and rescue operations, once in the Snowbird Wilderness, and once along the Bartram Trail near the Standing Indian Basin. Steep country, dense hardwood forests at lower elevations, shifting to spruce fir on the highest ridges. Soil so rich you could smell the decomposition from 20 feet. The Nantahala is old in a way that western forests aren't. The trees don't tower, they crowd. The hollows don't open, they fold. You don't look across that landscape. You look into it. I met my partner at the Chewa Ranger Station on Tuesday morning. His name was Ellis Dwyer, a civil engineering technician the district had assigned to handle the structural side of the assessment, while I managed the environmental and operational review. Ellis was 58, thick through the shoulders, with a gray mustache that looked like it had been growing since the Carter administration. He'd spent his entire career in Region 8, mostly in the Chattahoochee and the Nantahala, building and repairing the kind of backcountry roads that never appeared on any commercial map. He knew culvert specifications the way most people knew phone numbers, offhand and without effort. We spent that first morning going over the scope of work and loading the 2 ATVs the district had provided. I had GPS, camera, a handheld VHF radio, flagging tape, a Brunton compass, and a rolled set of the 1974 road plan drawings that Vasquez had found in a filing cabinet behind 3 boxes of decommissioned radio batteries. Ellis brought his own transit level, a fiberglass measuring tape, a soil probe, and a battered spiral notebook that he told me contained every road he'd personally inspected since 1981. Everyone? I asked. Everyone that mattered, he said, which I took to mean everyone. We drove out to the gate that afternoon. Road 1141 began at a paved County 2 lane about 4 miles south of Aquone, branching west into a narrow drainage between 2 ridges that the topo maps labeled as Hewitt Ridge to the north and an unnamed spur to the south. The gate was a standard Forest Service tubular steel barrier, painted brown, bolted to concrete posts on either side of the road. The lock was so corroded that the key Vasquez had given us wouldn't turn. Ellis cut it off with bolt cutters and replaced it with a new one from his truck. Behind the gate, the road simply vanished into the trees. That's not unusual for a road that's been closed for 30 years. Vegetation reclaims gravel surfaces quickly in the southern Appalachians, especially on north-facing slopes where moisture is constant. But what struck me was how completely the forest had taken it back. Within 50 yards of the gate, the road surface was indistinguishable from the surrounding forest floor. Tulip poplar saplings grew from the wheel ruts. Rhododendron had closed across the corridor from both sides, forming a tunnel so dense that the afternoon light dropped to what felt like early evening. The canopy overhead was unbroken. If you removed the gate, there would be no visible indication that a road had ever existed there. Ellis noticed it too. He stood at the edge of the rhododendron wall with his hands on his hips, looking at the density of the growth. 30 years doesn't do this, he said. I waited for him to elaborate. I've reopened roads that were closed 20-25 years. You get saplings, sure, brush, maybe some windfall across the lane. But the road prism is still there. The ditch lines are still there. The compacted surface resists root penetration for decades. He kicked at the ground beneath a poplar sapling. His boot hit soft earth, uncompacted, loamy. This is like the road was never built. I didn't have an explanation for that either, so I wrote it down, and we moved on. We cleared enough rhododendron to get the first ATV through and began our survey at 1,400 hours. The plan was to work roughly a mile per day, stopping to document every drainage structure, every cut slope, every section where the road crossed a stream or traversed a steep side hill. Ellis would assess the engineering. I would photograph, GPS mark each feature, and evaluate the environmental conditions, erosion, sedimentation, wildlife sign, vegetation encroachment. The first mile was slow. The road climbed gradually along the south side of the drainage, following Piercy Creek upstream. The creek was audible but rarely visible through the undergrowth. Bird song was heavy oven birds, wood thrushes, a red-eyed vireo that followed us for a quarter mile, repeating its phrase from somewhere above the canopy like a tour guide narrating our progress. The forest was second-growth hardwood, mostly tulip poplar, red oak, and hickory, with an understory of dogwood and sourwood that had gone leggy, reaching for light. According to the 1974 road plans, we should have crossed our first culvert at station 12+00, roughly 1,200 feet from the gate. Ellis had his measuring tape and was calling out stations as we moved. At 12+00, there was nothing. No culvert pipe, no head wall, no evidence of any drainage structure ever having been installed. The road plan showed a 24-inch corrugated metal pipe crossing beneath the road's surface at that point, carrying a seasonal drainage from the hillside above to the creek below. Ellis probed the soil. He walked the uphill side and the downhill side. He kicked through leaves and dug with his hands in two places where the inlet should have been. Nothing, he said. No pipe, no bedding material, no fill, nothing. Could it have been removed? Removing a culvert means excavating the road surface, pulling the pipe, and either replacing it or recontouring the channel. You'd see evidence of that for 50 years. Soil disturbance, different compaction, imported fill. There's none of that here. He looked at me. According to this plan, a culvert was installed right here in 1962. I'm standing where it should be, and there's no sign one was ever here. I photographed the location and marked it on the GPS. We moved on. At station 24+00, the plan showed a second culvert, 36-inch pipe carrying a perennial stream. Again, nothing. No pipe, no head wall, no fill, no evidence of installation or removal. The stream the culvert was supposed to carry was there, flowing clearly across the road's path. But it ran through an undisturbed natural channel. Moss-covered stones, root systems from mature trees growing directly in the flow path. A salamander, a blackbelly, I think sat motionless on a wet rock in the middle of the channel. That salamander bothered me. Not the animal itself, its position. It was sitting in the middle of what should have been a road. A road that had been built in 1962, engineered, surfaced, used by government vehicles for 12 years, and then closed. A blackbelly salamander does not colonize a spot where a gravel road existed within its lifetime. Their habitat requirements are specific: clean, cold, undisturbed stream margins. The stream crossing we were standing at looked like it hadn't been disturbed in a century. Ellis was flipping between the road plan and his notebook. He'd stopped talking, which I was beginning to recognize as his processing mode. He didn't think out loud. He went quiet, worked through something internally, and then delivered his conclusion as a finished product. "The road plan is wrong," he said finally. "How do you mean?" "This plan shows a road that was designed, engineered, and built to a specific standard. Culverts at specific stations, cut slopes at specific grades, a surface course of crushed aggregate over a prepared subbase. But what's actually here is an unimproved path through old growth regrowth. These two things can't both be true." He held up the plan. "Either this road was never built to this specification, or something happened to it that I've never seen happen to a road." I asked him which he thought was more likely. He didn't answer right away. He rolled the plan back up, tucked it under his arm, and looked down the corridor ahead of us, where the vegetation thickened again into a wall of laurel and rhododendron, so dense it seemed deliberate. "I've been building roads in these mountains for 31 years, he said. "Roads don't unbuild themselves." We made camp that evening at a wide spot in the road corridor near station 40+00, roughly 3/4 of a mile from the gate. I use the word corridor loosely. By that point, the only evidence we were following a road alignment at all was the slight depression in the terrain and the occasional survey markers, small aluminum tags nailed to trees at the edge of the right-of-way. Even those were embedded so deeply in bark growth that they were nearly invisible. Trees don't grow that much bark in 30 years. The markers looked like they'd been in place for 60 or 70. Ellis started a small campfire while I set up the 2 tents we'd brought. The evening was warm, but not uncomfortable, mid-60s, with a light breeze from the west carrying the smell of rain that hadn't arrived yet. Piercy Creek was maybe 100 yards below us through the trees, and its sound filled the hollow with a constant low static that blended into the background after a few minutes. We ate MREs and went over the day's findings. In one afternoon, we documented the complete absence of 2 culverts that the road plan showed as installed, the total absence of any compacted road surface, the presence of mature vegetation growing where engineered structures should have been, and the absence of any evidence that the road had been decommissioned, regraded, or restored after closure. "So, what do we write?" I asked. "We write what we found. Conditions do not match the road plan. Recommend further archival research to verify construction history." "You think it was never built?" Ellis poked at the fire. "I think the first mile was never built. Not to this plan. Maybe they surveyed it, drew it up, staked it, and never got funding. Happens all the time. The plan goes in the file, the gate goes up because there's nothing to drive on. And 30 years later, someone sends 2 guys out to figure out why the road is closed." He shrugged. Mystery solved. It was a clean explanation, logical, bureaucratically plausible. It accounted for everything we'd seen. I wanted to accept it, and I might have if it weren't for the gate. The gate was real. Tubular steel, professionally installed, bolted to engineered concrete footings that had been poured in place. You don't gate a road that was never built. You gate a road that people were driving on and need to stop driving on. The gate implied traffic. Traffic implied a road. A road implied construction. Construction implied culverts, grading, surfacing all the things the plan described and the ground did not. I mentioned this to Ellis. He listened, stared at the fire for a while, and then said something that stayed with me. Maybe the road was there when they put the gate up, and then it wasn't. Wasn't what? There. I waited for him to walk it back or add a qualifier. He didn't. He finished his coffee, rinsed his cup, and went to his tent. I stayed by the fire for another 20 minutes, watching it burn down. The forest around us was dense and close, the way Appalachian hollows get after dark when the canopy seals off the sky and the only light is whatever you brought with you. Barred owls were calling from both ridges, the classic "who cooks for you" pattern, back and forth, overlapping. A normal sound, a sound I'd heard 1,000 times. But between the owl calls, during the pauses when both birds were silent, the hollow was quiet in a way that didn't match the environment. No insect noise, no rustle of small mammals in the leaf litter, no frog calls from the creek margin, even though we were in prime habitat for spring peepers and gray tree frogs at that elevation in early May. The owls were calling. The creek was running. And between those 2 sounds, there was a silence so complete it felt structural, like the quiet wasn't an absence of noise, but the presence of something that replaced it. I made sure the fire was fully out, checked that both ATVs were secured, and zipped myself into my tent. I fell asleep quickly. I almost always do in the field. Sometime after midnight, I woke to Ellis unzipping his tent. I heard him walk a few steps, stop, and stand still. I assumed he'd gotten up to relieve himself, but he didn't move. He just stood there. 1 minute, 2. I was about to call out to him when he spoke, quietly enough that I knew he was talking to himself rather than to me. "That's not right." Then he came back, zipped up his tent, and went silent. In the morning, I asked him what he'd been looking at. He was crouched by the remains of our fire ring, heating water for coffee on a small backpacking stove. He didn't look up. "The survey markers," he said. "On the trees." "What about them?" "I checked 2 of them yesterday afternoon. Aluminum tags nailed at chest height. Standard USFS right-of-way markers." "Right." When I got up last night, the fire was still giving off a little light. I could see the closest tree, that tulip poplar, about 15 feet from your tent. I checked the marker on it yesterday. Nailed right through the bark at about 5 feet off the ground. He poured the hot water carefully into his cup. "Last night, it was at the base of the tree, on the ground. Bark had grown over where it used to be, completely healed." I looked at the tree. I walked to it and crouched down. The aluminum tag was exactly where he described, lying at the base of the trunk, half buried in leaf litter. The bark above it, at roughly the 5-foot height where Ellis said it had been nailed, was smooth and unbroken. No nail hole, no scar, no staining from the aluminum. The tree had the appearance of never having been marked at all. "That tag was nailed in yesterday when I checked it," Ellis said from behind me. I tugged on it. It was solid. 40 years of bark growth around it. I picked up the tag. It was bent slightly and the nail was still through its center hole, but the nail was clean. No bark residue, no wood fibers. It looked like it had been pulled straight out of fresh lumber, not extracted from 40 years of living tree. I set the tag down, stood up, and looked at Ellis. He was watching me with an expression I'd seen on experienced professionals only a handful of times, the expression of a man who has just observed something that his entire career tells him cannot happen, and who is deciding in real time whether to trust his experience or his eyes. "We should check the second marker," I said. We did. It was the same. Tag on the ground. Bark smooth and healed. No evidence it had ever been attached. I documented both locations with photographs and GPS coordinates. Neither of us offered an explanation. Neither of us forced one. We broke camp and continued the survey westward, deeper into the drainage, following the ghost of a road that the forest was disowning one piece at a time. By 9 o'clock, we'd covered another quarter mile, and the pattern held. Every feature the road plan promised, the ground denied. At station 52+00, the plan showed a turnout, a widened section where vehicles could pass each other on the single-lane road. The terrain at that station was a uniform slope, undisturbed, carpeted in trillium and mayapple. No widening, no shoulder, no indication the hillside had ever been cut. At station 58+00, the plan showed a 30-degree curve with a super-elevated surface and a rock-retaining wall on the downhill side. The alignment we followed did curve there, gently. But the slope below was natural, root-laced soil, embedded stones wearing moss so thick it looked like upholstery, and a single hemlock growing directly where the retaining wall should have stood. The hemlock was at least 18 inches in diameter. I cored it later that day with a borrowed increment borer from Ellis's kit. The tree was 73 years old. It had been growing in that spot since 1931, 3 decades before the road was supposedly built through it. Ellis wrote the core count in his notebook without comment. He'd stopped offering theories. We were documenting now with the grim thoroughness of people who know their report is going to raise questions they can't answer. The drainage narrowed around station 65+00. The ridges on either side pressed closer together, and Piercy Creek, which had been a distant sound below us, rose to meet the road alignment as the terrain funneled inward. The canopy was lower here, a mix of hemlock and white pine that filtered the light into something gray-green and aquatic. The understory thinned because so little sun reached the ground, and for the first time since the gate, I could actually see a distance of more than 30 or 40 feet through the trees. That's when I noticed the cut. It was on the uphill side of the alignment, maybe 200 feet ahead of us. A vertical face of exposed earth, roughly 8 feet tall and 40 feet long, running parallel to our line of travel. A road cut, the kind of clean, engineered excavation you make when you're carving a bench into a hillside for a road to sit on. It was eroded, softened by decades of rain and root activity, but unmistakable. The angle was too uniform to be natural. The soil profile was too clean. Someone had cut into that hillside with heavy equipment a long time ago. Ellis saw it the same moment I did. He stopped his ATV and sat there for a full 10 seconds before he shut off the engine. "Well," he said, "there it is." We walked to the cut face together. Ellis ran his hand along the exposed soil, brushing away a curtain of hanging rootlets. Beneath them, the cut was textbook, a 1-to-1 slope ratio, consistent with Forest Service road construction standards from the 1960s. At the base of the cut, I could see the remnants of a ditch line, partially filled with sediment, but still holding its shape. And beyond the ditch, for the first time since the gate, there was something that looked like a road surface. A strip of ground, roughly 12 feet wide, that was flatter, more compacted, and slightly elevated above the surrounding terrain. "It was built," Ellis said quietly. "At least this section was." I knelt on the road surface and pressed my palm flat against it. The soil was firm. Not natural firm like undisturbed forest floor, but mechanically firm, the way compacted aggregate feels after years of consolidation. I scraped away the leaf litter with my fingers and found small angular stones, crushed rock, the remains of a surface course. "So the first mile was never built, and this section was?" "I don't know what the first mile was," Ellis said. "I know what it isn't now, and I know what this is." He was already moving along the cut face, measuring its height with his tape, checking the slope angle with a hand level he pulled from his vest pocket. "This is a Forest Service road. This was built to the plan. Right here, everything matches." He was right. For the next 400 feet, the road was real. The cut slopes were visible. The ditch lines were traceable. The road surface, though buried under 30 years of leaf litter, was intact beneath a few inches of organic accumulation. At station 70+00, we found our first culvert, a 24-inch corrugated metal pipe, heavily rusted but still in place. Its inlet partially blocked with debris, and its outlet discharging a thin trickle of water into a rock-lined channel that led downslope to the creek. Ellis measured it. The gauge, diameter, length, and bedding depth matched the road plan exactly. I stood there looking at that pipe and felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. A rusted culvert in the ground, where the plane said it should be, was the most normal thing we'd encountered in 2 days. It meant the road had existed. It meant the plan was accurate. It meant there was a rational explanation for the first mile, maybe a phased construction, maybe a partial build, maybe a section that was decommissioned more aggressively than the rest. Something explicable. Something an engineer could put in a report without feeling like he'd lost his professional footing. Ellis didn't share my relief. He was standing at the outlet end of the culvert, frowning at the discharge channel. I walked down to him and looked where he was looking. The rocks lining the channel below the culvert outlet were arranged. Not placed by an engineer, arranged differently than that. Each stone was set with its flattest face up, creating a smooth, stepped surface that guided the water downhill in a series of small, controlled drops. It was elegant in a way that standard erosion control isn't. Forest Service outlet protection uses riprap, large angular stones dumped loosely to dissipate energy. This was something else. Each stone was chosen for its shape and placed with deliberate care, like someone had spent an afternoon fitting them together. "That's not in the plan," Ellis said. I checked. He was right. The road plan showed standard riprap at the outlet. What we were looking at was more like masonry. "Could it be CCC work?" I asked. The Civilian Conservation Corps had built extensively throughout the Nantahala in the 1930s, and their stonework was distinctive, careful, fitted, built to last. The road wasn't built until '62. The CCC was long gone by then. Maybe they built the drainage structure earlier. Stream stabilization, erosion control. Then the road is built over it later. Ellis considered this. Maybe. But the pipe goes through the road fill and into this channel. They're connected. You don't build an outlet channel 30 years before you install the pipe it's designed to catch. He photographed the stonework from several angles, while I sketched its layout in my field book. We'd been on the ground for barely 4 hours and already had more anomalies than I'd recorded on any infrastructure assessment in my career. We continued west. The road remained visible cut slopes, ditch lines, compacted surface for another quarter mile. Then it stopped. Not gradually, not through progressive deterioration. It stopped the way a sentence stops when someone takes away the page. At station 82+00, the cut slope simply ended. The hillside resumed its natural contour as though it had never been touched. The ditch line vanished. The compacted surface gave way to soft forest floor. One step I was walking on an engineered road bench, and the next I was walking through undisturbed woods. Ellis walked back and forth across the transition 3 times. He probed the soil on both sides. He checked the road plan, which showed the road continuing without interruption through station 82+00 and beyond. "It's not decommissioned," he said. "It's not failed. It's not buried." He stood at the exact line where the road stopped existing and held his arms out, one hand over road, one hand over forest. "It's just gone." We ate lunch sitting on the engineered section, our backs against the cut slope, looking out across the transition into nothing. Piercy Creek was closer now, maybe 30 yards downhill, running clear and steady over a cobble bed. A Louisiana water thrush was working the stream edge, bobbing its tail with that rhythmic dipping motion they use while feeding. Normal. All of it was normal, except for the road that existed where we sat and didn't exist where we were headed. "I want to show you something," Ellis said. He'd pulled out his notebook and was flipping through pages. He found what he was looking for and turned the book so I could see it. A hand-drawn table, 2 columns. On the left, station numbers. On the right, single-word descriptions. He'd written absent next to every station from the gate to roughly 65+00. Then present from 65+00 to 82+00. Then absent again. "You've been tracking this." "I've been tracking this." He tapped the page. 1,700 feet of road. That's what exists out of... He checked the plan. Roughly 90,000 linear feet of surveyed alignment. 1,700 feet of actual road. The rest is either gone or was never there. "We've only surveyed 1.5 miles. There could be more constructed sections ahead." "There could be." He didn't sound convinced. I asked him something that had been forming in my mind since the previous evening. The closure order. Galt's recommendation. He wrote structural degradation. If the road was already mostly gone in 1974, what structures was he talking about? Ellis closed his notebook. Maybe the same ones we're sitting on. Maybe this section and a few others. Maybe the road was always discontinuous, built in pieces, never connected, abandoned before completion. Then what was the gate for? He didn't answer that. He put his notebook away and started packing up our lunch trash. We pressed on through the afternoon. The road plan showed the alignment climbing out of the Piercy Creek drainage over the next 2 miles, switchbacking up the south face of Hewitt Ridge before descending into a secondary drainage on the far side. These would be the most heavily engineered sections. The switchbacks would require significant cut and fill work, retaining structures and careful drainage management on steep slopes. If those sections existed, they would confirm that the road had been substantially built. If they didn't, Ellis's incomplete construction theory would gain strength, and our recommendation would be straightforward. Decommission the paper road, remove the gate, let the forest keep what it had already taken back. By 3 o'clock, we'd reach station 100+00, roughly a mile from the gate. The drainage was pinching tight. The creek ran close to the alignment now, and the slopes on both sides were steepening toward the ridge. Rhododendron was thick again, and the light had taken on that subaqueous quality that comes from dense evergreen canopy over moving water. The air was cooler in the narrows, noticeably so, maybe 8 or 10 degrees below what we'd felt on the more open sections. My breath didn't fog, but it felt close. Ellis stopped his ATV suddenly. I pulled up behind him and shut my engine off. He was looking at the ground ahead, where the road alignment crossed a flat bench above the creek. There was a building, not a ruin, not a foundation, a building. A single-room log structure, roughly 12 by 16 feet, with the intact roof of hand-split wooden shingles. The walls were constructed of hewn logs, not round, but squared on 2 faces and chinked with what appeared to be a mixture of clay and moss. The door was a single plank affair, closed, hanging from hand-forged iron hinges. There were no windows. The ridgeline of the roof was straight and level. The structure was in a condition that I would have described as maintained, except that it was sitting in the middle of a national forest on a road that had been closed to all access for 30 years. "That's not on the plan," I said. "No. Is it on any map you've seen?" Ellis pulled out the district recreation map, the topo quad, and 2 older planning maps he'd brought. He checked each one. "No, there's nothing shown at this location on any map." We approached on foot. The building sat squarely on the road alignment, not beside it, but on it, as though the road had been built to this point and the structure placed where the road would have continued. Or as though the structure had been there first and the road had been routed to meet it. The logs were old. I've seen enough historic structures in the national forests to make rough age estimates based on weathering, tool marks, and construction technique. The hewn faces showed broad axe marks, the kind of long, slightly concave facets left by a felling axe used as a hewing tool. A technique common in southern Appalachian construction from the mid-1800s through the early 1900s. The chinking was intact, which was remarkable. Clay chinking normally requires regular maintenance, and exposed to 30 years of weather without attention, it should have deteriorated significantly. This chinking looked as though it had been applied recently pliable, firmly seated, with no cracking or separation from the log surfaces. Ellis walked the perimeter while I photographed the exterior. The building had no foundation in any engineered sense. The bottom log sat directly on the ground, resting on flat stones placed at the corners and midpoints. This was consistent with traditional Appalachian construction. The roof shingles were wooden-rived, not sawn, and they overlapped in tight courses that showed no significant curling or decay. "I don't like this," Ellis said. He'd completed his circuit and was standing at the front of the building, looking at the door. What specifically? The condition. A building this age, with this construction, in this climate, closed up in the woods for 30 years minimum? The roof should be failing. The bottom logs should be rotted through from ground contact. The chinking should be gone. He touched the nearest log. This wood is sound. Not just sound hard, harder than it should be. I pressed my thumb against the same log. He was right. The wood had a density to it that didn't match what I'd expect from aged, exposed timber. It felt almost petrified. Not stone, exactly, but somewhere on the spectrum between living wood and mineral. I tried the door. It opened inward with no resistance. No creak. The hinges moved freely, as though recently oiled. Though when I looked at them closely, there was no oil or grease on the metal, just bare iron. Dark with age, but showing no significant rust. Inside, the building was dark and cool. The air smelled like old wood and something mineral, not unpleasant, but specific. Like the inside of a cave, or the space beneath a very old bridge. The floor was packed earth, smooth and slightly concave in the center, worn by use. Against the far wall, there was a low wooden shelf or bench built into the log wall at about knee height. On the shelf sat 3 objects. A glass jar with a wire bale closure, empty and clean. A folded piece of cloth canvas or heavy cotton roughly the size of a hand towel. And a survey marker. An aluminum tag identical to the ones we'd found on the trees. Except this one was stamped with a station number I hadn't seen yet on our survey. 440 plus 00. Station 440 plus 00 was over 8 miles ahead of us. Deep in the alignment. Past the switchbacks, past the ridge crossing, somewhere in the secondary drainage, on the far side of Hewitt Ridge. We hadn't been anywhere close to it. We wouldn't reach it for days. Ellis picked up the tag and turned it over. On the back, someone had scratched 4 words into the aluminum with a sharp point. The letters were crude but legible. Do not complete survey. He set the tag back on the shelf exactly where it had been. He looked at me. I looked at him. Neither of us spoke for what must have been 15 seconds. We need to report this, I said. Report what exactly? That we found an old building that's not on any map? That happens every other year in these mountains. Homestead remnants, old hunter cabins, CCC structures that never got inventoried. The tag, Ellis. The tag is a survey marker. Someone could have carried it here from anywhere. It's stamped 440 plus 00. That's a station on our road alignment, our specific alignment. And someone scratched a message on it telling us not to finish the survey. Telling someone, not necessarily us. Who else has surveyed this road? That stopped him. He looked at the tag again, then at the jar, then at the cloth. He didn't touch any of them. When was the last time anyone was in here? He said, half to himself. He crouched and studied the packed earth floor. No footprints, no disturbance. The fine layer of dust on the shelf was uniform around the objects, as if they'd been sitting there long enough for the dust to accumulate evenly, but not long enough to bury them. Months, maybe, or years. In a sealed building with no windows, dust accumulation would be slow and steady. I radioed the district office. Vasquez answered. I told her we'd found an uncharted structure on the road alignment and requested any historical records of buildings in the Piercy Creek drainage. She said she'd check. I didn't mention the survey tag. I wanted to discuss that with Ellis first, away from the building, in the open air where things tended to feel more rational. We backed out and closed the door. The afternoon had shifted while we were inside. Clouds had moved in from the west, and the hollow had darkened further. The temperature had dropped. I checked my watch, 4:15. We had maybe 2 hours of usable daylight. "We should camp here," Ellis said. "There's flat ground, we're near water, and I want to look at this building in morning light." I agreed. We set up camp about 40 feet from the structure, on the uphill side, close enough to keep it in sight, far enough to feel like we weren't sleeping in its shadow. Ellis was methodical with his tent placement, orienting the door toward the building, which I noticed but didn't comment on. I did the same. Vasquez radioed back at 5:30. She'd found one reference to a structure in the Piercy Creek drainage, a single line item in a 1938 CCC project inventory listing one storage building, Piercy Creek, condition fair, no action recommended. No coordinates, no dimensions, no photograph, no mention of it in any subsequent document. The building had been noted once, 66 years ago, and then apparently forgotten. "Storage building," Ellis said when I relayed the information. "Storage for what?" "Doesn't say." In 1938, the CCC was building trails and fire roads in this district. They might have used a remote building for tool storage, equipment caching. But this drainage is a long way from any of their major project sites. He was consulting his maps again, tracing routes with his finger. "There's no reason to cache anything here. There's nothing here. There's a road. There's 1,700 feet of road, and a building that shouldn't be in the condition it's in." He folded the maps. "And a survey tag from a station we haven't reached with a message telling us to turn around." Dinner was quiet. We heated our food on the backpacking stove and ate without much conversation, which was unusual. Ellis was a talker by nature. He'd spent most of the first day narrating his history with road projects, recounting arguments with contractors, explaining the finer points of culvert sizing with a passion that bordered on evangelical. But that evening, he ate in silence, looking at the building every few minutes, the way you look at a parked car on a street where no cars should be. I used the quiet to review my notes. In a day and a half, we'd documented a road that appeared and disappeared without engineering explanation. 2 survey markers that had apparently removed themselves from living trees overnight. A building in impossible condition containing an object from a location we hadn't visited, and a handwritten message warning against the completion of the work we'd been sent to do. Each observation, taken alone, had a possible explanation. Survey markers can be removed by animals or fall out as trees grow. Old buildings sometimes survive when logic says they shouldn't. The message could have been scratched by anyone at any time, for any reason. The road's condition could reflect construction irregularities that were never properly documented. But together, the observations pointed in a direction I didn't have a name for. The cumulative weight of them was pressing against the borders of my professional vocabulary, and I didn't have a word for the territory beyond those borders. The owls started again after dark. Same pattern as the previous night, barred owls, calling from the ridges, their voices overlapping in the hollow like a conversation held across a crowded room. And again, between their calls, that silence. Deep, structural, the kind of silence that made me aware of the sound of my own blood moving. I slept poorly, not because of fear. I wasn't afraid yet, not exactly, but because my mind wouldn't stop organizing the data, looking for the pattern that would make everything ordinary. Every time I thought I'd found one of the observations would refuse to fit, and the pattern would collapse, and I'd start over. Sometime around 2 in the morning, I heard a sound I couldn't immediately classify. A low, resonant tone, like someone drawing a bow across a very thick string. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds, and it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. A vibration more than a sound, something I felt in my sternum as much as heard with my ears. It didn't repeat. I lay still and listened for 10 minutes. Nothing. Just the creak. Just the silence between the creak's syllables. In the morning, Ellis was already up, standing at the building's door. It was open. "Did you open it?" I asked. "No." "Did you hear anything last night?" He turned and looked at me. "Like what?" "A low sound, a vibration, around 2 a.m. I heard the creak." This was different, lower, almost subsonic. He shook his head slowly. "I slept through, but I want to show you something." He stepped aside so I could see through the open door into the building's interior. The morning light was angled low enough to penetrate a few feet inside, illuminating the shelf against the far wall. The jar was still there. The cloth was still there. The survey tag was gone. I walked in and looked. The dust on the shelf showed the outline where the tag had been, a clean, rectangular shape in the fine particulate layer, like a stencil. But the tag itself was absent. I checked the floor. Nothing. I checked outside the door, around the perimeter, in the leaf litter. Nothing. "It was here yesterday," I said. "It was. And the door was closed when we left." "It was. And neither of us opened it." "No." I stood in the doorway and looked at the shelf with its 2 remaining objects and its 1 clean absence, and I felt something shift in the architecture of the assessment. Up to that point, I'd been conducting an infrastructure review with unusual findings. From that point forward, whether I admitted it to myself or not, I was conducting an investigation into something I didn't understand. I radioed Vasquez and gave her a status update. Road conditions poor. Structural assessment ongoing. Estimated 2 more days to reach the midpoint of the alignment. I didn't mention the tag. I didn't mention the building's door. I didn't mention any of it, because I didn't know how to describe what was happening in language that would survive a government radio frequency. What I did say was that we'd found an uncharted historic structure that might qualify for cultural resource documentation, and that I recommended the district archaeologist be notified. Vasquez agreed and said she'd make the call. We packed camp and continued west. The road alignment climbed now, angling away from Piercy Creek and up the south face of Hewitt Ridge. The plan showed the first switchback at station 120+00, where the road would double back on itself and gain elevation through a series of engineered turns cut into the mountainside. The forest changed as we climbed. The hemlocks dropped away, replaced by chestnut oak and scarlet oak on the drier upper slopes. The understory opened into a carpet of galax and trailing arbutus, and the light improved as the canopy thinned at the higher elevation. I could see the ridge above us now, a long, even crest running east to west, timbered but not densely so. At station 120+00, we found the switchback. It existed, fully constructed. The cut slope was 15 feet tall at the apex of the turn, carved into decomposed gneiss that had weathered to a pale orange. The road surface was intact beneath the leaf litter, compacted, graded, with a visible cross-slope designed to shed water to the inside of the curve. A stone-lined drainage channel ran along the base of the cut, directing water to a drop inlet that fed another culvert beneath the road. Ellis checked the pipe. 36 inches, corrugated metal, exactly as specified in the plan. Functional, clear. Water was actually flowing through it, a small seep from the cut slope above. "Built," Ellis said. "Built right." The second switchback was the same. And the third. For the next mile, climbing up the ridge, the road was unambiguously real, engineered, constructed, maintained at some point in its history. The cut slopes were weathered but stable. The culverts were in place. At one point, we found the remains of a log crib retaining wall, partially collapsed but clearly original to the construction period. Ellis measured, photographed, and documented everything with the focused energy of a man who has just been proven right about something after a period of serious doubt. The road existed. It had been built. The question was no longer whether the plan was fiction. The question was what had happened to the sections that were missing. We crested Hewitt Ridge at station 155+00, roughly 3 miles from the gate. The road passed through a shallow saddle between two high points, and for a few hundred yards, we had a view in both directions, east toward the Piercy Creek drainage we'd come from, west toward the secondary drainage the road descended into on the far side. The western view showed a deep, heavily forested hollow dropping away steeply, with a thin line of lighter green along the bottom that marked a stream course. The road plan showed the alignment descending through 5 more switchbacks into that hollow, crossing the stream on a single-lane bridge, and continuing along the far bank for another 7 miles to its terminus. Ellis pulled out a pair of binoculars and glassed the western slope. He scanned slowly, left to right, bottom to top. Then he lowered the binoculars and handed them to me without a word. I looked where he'd been looking. It took me a moment to understand what I was seeing. The western slope of Hewitt Ridge was scarred. Not recently, the scars were old, softened by decades of vegetation recovery, but they were visible from the ridgetop as a series of parallel lines running diagonally down the mountainside, spaced at regular intervals. Switchback cuts. The road had been built on that slope too. I could trace at least 3 of the 5 switchbacks the plan described, visible as faint terraces in the forest canopy where the trees were slightly shorter, slightly younger, growing on disturbed soil. But between the switchback scars, in 2 places, the lines simply stopped, interrupted. The terrace would run for a few hundred feet, and then the mountain would resume its natural contour, uncut, as though the road had been erased from specific sections while leaving the rest intact. I lowered the binoculars. "It's the same pattern," I said. "It's the same pattern," Ellis confirmed. "Built, then not built. Present, then absent. Not destroyed absent, like it was removed from the record." We descended. The afternoon was warm and still, the kind of early May day in the southern mountains, where the air feels thick with pollen and possibility, and every surface is producing something green. The road held together through the first 2 switchbacks on the western descent, then vanished at station 172+00, then reappeared at station 185+00, then vanished again. The pattern was exactly what it had been on the eastern side, long stretches of fully engineered road, alternating with stretches of undisturbed forest that showed no evidence of construction, removal, or disturbance. Ellis had stopped writing present and absent in his notebook. He'd developed a shorthand, a solid line for existing road, a broken line for missing road. His page looked like Morse code. We reached the stream crossing at station 210+00 in late afternoon. The plan showed a bridge here, a single-span timber structure on concrete abutments, 32 feet long, designed to carry the road across what the plan labeled as West Fork Piercy Creek. The stream was there. The abutments were not. The bridge was not. There was no evidence of either. But the stream itself gave me pause. It was clear, cold, and fast-moving, a typical southern Appalachian mountain stream, perhaps 10 feet wide and 18 inches deep at the crossing point. The stream bed was cobble and gravel, clean, with good sorting that indicated natural deposition over a long period. No sedimentation from road runoff, no concrete fragments, no debris from a collapsed structure. On a flat stone near the water's edge, stacked in a careful column, sat 6 more survey tags. They were identical to the ones we'd found before, aluminum, USFS standard, stamped with station numbers. I read them off while Ellis wrote them down. 280 plus 00, 310 plus 00, 345 plus 00, 390 plus 00, 410 plus 00, and 440 plus 00. Station 440 plus 00. The same number that had been on the tag in the building. The tag that had disappeared from the shelf overnight. I picked up the stack carefully. The tags were clean, unstained, as though freshly stamped. Beneath the bottom tag, scratched into the flat surface of the stone itself, were 4 words in the same crude lettering we'd seen on the back of the first tag. "The road remembers you." Ellis read the words. He read them again. He took 2 steps back from the stream's edge and stood with his hands at his sides. And I watched him make a decision. I could see it happen, a physical process, like watching someone set a bone. His jaw tightened, his shoulders squared. He looked at me with the expression of a man who has decided that whatever is happening, he will respond to it with the tools he has rather than the fear he feels. "Someone is doing this," he said. "Someone is out here with us. Someone who has access to survey markers, knows our alignment, and is playing a very elaborate game. Through a gate that's been locked for 30 years. The lock was corroded. Anyone with bolt cutters could have gotten through. We did. And the building? The condition? The door? Old buildings survive. Doors open. Wind, animals, settling." He pointed at the scratched message. "That took a person, a human hand, a sharp object, and a flat rock, and a decision to write a sentence. That's not a mystery. That's a person." It was the most reasonable explanation available. It was also the explanation that required ignoring several things we'd both seen with our own eyes: the healed bark, the petrified wood, the 73-year-old hemlock growing where a retaining wall should have stood. But I understood why Ellis needed it. A person in the woods was a problem with a solution. You could track a person, report a person, confront a person. A person operated within the boundaries of a world Ellis had spent 31 years learning to navigate. I let him have it, for now. "If someone's out here," I said, "we should see evidence, footprints, camps, trail wear, trash." Then we looked for evidence. We spent the remaining daylight searching the area around the stream crossing. We walked both banks for 100 yards in each direction. We checked for boot prints in the soft soil near the water. We looked for cut vegetation, broken branches, fire rings, litter, any of the signs that a human presence leaves in the backcountry, no matter how careful. We found nothing. The forest on both sides of the stream was undisturbed. The leaf litter was intact. The only tracks were animal, deer, raccoon, what I thought was a gray fox. No human sign whatsoever, except the tags on the stone and the message scratched beneath them. We made camp on the east bank, 30 yards upstream of the crossing. The evening settled in around us with that slow Appalachian fade, the sky going from blue to steel to purple behind the ridge. The birds cycling through their evening repertoire. The creek providing its constant narration. I built a fire while Ellis sat on a log and studied his notebook, flipping between pages, comparing station numbers. The missing sections, he said after a while. They're not random. I sat down across from him. How do you mean? I've been mapping what's present and what's absent. The road exists in specific segments. The section in the narrows, the switchbacks going up, most of the switchbacks coming down. But the connecting sections between those engineered features are gone. The flat, easy stretches, the parts that would have been simplest to build, those are the ones that are missing. That's backwards. That's exactly backwards. If a road is going to fail, the engineered sections fail first. Cut slopes slump, retaining walls collapse. Culverts plug and the road washes out. The flat, tangent sections are the last to deteriorate because there's nothing to go wrong. But here, it's the opposite. The hard parts survived, and the easy parts vanished. He let that sit between us. The fire cracked and settled. A barred owl started up from somewhere on the ridge above us, and this time, only one answered. And the tags? I asked. The ones on the stone, those station numbers. Ellis nodded slowly. I checked. Every station number on those tags corresponds to a location in the missing sections. Every single one. Whoever left them is identifying the places where the road isn't. Or the places where it used to be. He looked at me across the fire. The light caught his face in a way that made him look older than 58, and tired in a way that wasn't physical. You're starting to think this isn't a person, he said. I didn't answer right away. I listened to the creek and to the owl, and to the silence between them that had become as familiar as a third companion on the trip. I'm starting to think that whether it's a person or not, the road is the message, I said. Someone or something is showing us what's missing and telling us not to finish the survey. The question I keep coming back to isn't who or what, it's why. Ellis stared at the fire for a long time. P.T.R. Galt, he said. The ranger who closed the road. His order didn't say why. 2 pages, no photographs. Fastest closure in district history. He looked up. What if he saw what we're seeing? What if he came out here, found the same thing, and shut it down because he didn't know what else to do? I'd been thinking the same thing. And I'd been thinking about the message on the building tag, "Do not complete survey," and wondering whether it was a warning left for us specifically, or a warning left for anyone who came looking. A warning that P.T.R. Galt might have read 30 years ago. Standing in the same drainage, hearing the same creak, feeling the same shift in the architecture of what he thought was possible. A warning he'd apparently taken seriously enough to close a road in 6 days. I slept that night the way you sleep when your mind is working on something it can't solve in shallow stretches, dipping under and surfacing, never fully losing the thread of where I was. The creak was constant. The owl had gone silent by midnight. Around 3 in the morning, I heard the sound again. The same low tone, that bowed string resonance that seemed to originate from the ground itself, vibrating up through the packed earth beneath my sleeping pad and into the bones of my chest. This time it lasted longer, 5 seconds, maybe 6, and it carried a quality I hadn't noticed the first time. It pulsed, not like a heartbeat, but like breath. A slow, measured fluctuation in intensity, as though the source was drawing in and pushing out. I unzipped my tent and looked out. The fire was dead. Starlight reached the hollow in fragments, broken by the canopy overhead. I could see the outline of Ellis's tent, the dark shapes of the ATVs, the faint silver line of the creek reflecting what little light made it through the trees. Nothing was moving. Nothing was visible that shouldn't have been. But the forest floor was warm. I noticed it when I put my hand down to steady myself in the tent doorway. The ground was warm. Not hot, not alarming, but distinctly above the ambient temperature of the air. The kind of warmth you feel from soil that's been in full sun all day, except that this ground had been under dense canopy for decades, and it was 3 in the morning. I pressed my palm flat and held it there. The warmth was steady and even, not localized. It felt the same everywhere I touched. I reached further out, feeling the leaf litter, the bare soil, the root of a hemlock near my tent. All warm, all the same temperature. The tone faded. The warmth remained for perhaps another minute, then gradually dissipated until the ground felt normal cool, slightly damp. The way mountain forest soil feels at that hour. I lay back down. I didn't sleep again. At first light, I checked the area around our camp. No disturbance, no tracks. The survey tags were still stacked on the stone by the creek. The stream was running clear. Everything looked exactly as it had the evening before. I walked to the stone and crouched beside it, rereading the scratched message. The road remembers you. The letters were angular and uneven, cut into the rock with enough force to leave grooves maybe a 1/16 of an inch deep. I ran my finger along them. The edges of the grooves were sharp. Fresh stone, no weathering, no lichen starting in the cuts. This message had been made recently, days, maybe, weeks at most. Ellis emerged from his tent at 6:15, looking like a man who'd slept exactly as much as I had. He heated water without speaking, and we drank our coffee standing up, both of us facing west, looking down the drainage toward the sections of road we hadn't yet surveyed. "I heard the sound last night," I said. He looked at me over the rim of his cup. "The vibration." "You heard it too." "This time, yes." He took a slow drink. "Around 3? "Around 3. Did you feel the ground?" So he'd noticed it too. "Warm," I said. "Warm." He nodded once. "I've worked in areas with geothermal activity. Hot springs, warm ground. It happens. Western North Carolina has thermal features. Hot springs up on the French Broad is only about 60 miles from here." "You think this is geothermal?" "I think warm ground has an explanation, and geothermal is one. The sound could be related water moving through subsurface fractures, compressed air in rock voids. The Blue Ridge is full of caves and karst features that nobody's mapped." He was doing what he'd done with the person in the woods theory, reaching for the nearest rational framework and pulling it over the evidence like a tarp. And again, it wasn't wrong, exactly. Geothermal anomalies exist. Subsurface sounds exist. The southern Appalachians sit on ancient metamorphic rock riddled with fractures and unmapped voids. Every individual piece of evidence could be draped in a plausible explanation if you were willing to ignore the shape of the thing underneath. I wasn't willing anymore. But I also wasn't ready to say that out loud, because I didn't have a better framework to offer. Saying, "This can't be explained," isn't useful in the field. It doesn't change your next decision. It doesn't tell you where to put your feet. And out here, where to put your feet was still the most important question. "We need to reach the bridge site and continue west," I said. "The plan shows the most complex engineering on the far side of the creek. Retaining walls, a long side hill traverse, and the road terminus. If those sections exist, we document them. If they don't, we document that. Either way, we're past the midpoint today." Ellis rinsed his cup. "And the tags? The message?" "We document those too, every one. Photographs, GPS, field notes. Whatever is happening here, the record needs to be complete." He studied me for a moment, then nodded. "Complete, all right?" We broke camp and forded the stream on foot, walking the ATVs across one at a time through the shallow riffle below the missing bridge site. The water was cold enough to ache through my boots. On the west bank, The road plan showed the alignment turning south and beginning a long, gradual traverse along the slope above the stream, contouring around the head of the drainage, before turning west again toward the terminus. Within 200 yards of the crossing, we found road. Full, engineered, unmistakable road. Cut slope on the uphill side, 6 feet of exposed rock face showing drill and blast marks where the builders had carved through a resistant ledge of gneiss. Fill slope on the downhill side, compacted and graded, held in place by a dry stacked stone retaining wall that ran continuously for over 100 feet. The road surface was intact crushed stone, well drained, firm under our tires. For the first time on the entire survey, I could have driven a pickup truck on this road without hesitation. Ellis was almost giddy. That's not a word I'd normally use for a 58-year-old engineer. But there was a relief in his body language that bordered on joy. He photographed the retaining wall from every angle. He measured the cut slope height, the road width, the fill depth. He tested the wall's stability by pushing against individual stones. Everything was solid. Everything was built to standard. Everything matched the plan. "This is the best preserved section we've seen," he said. "This is 30-year-old road that looks like it was built 10 years ago. The drainage is functioning. The wall hasn't moved. The surface is..." He stopped. He was looking at the road surface ahead of us, where the alignment curved gently around a rock outcrop. There were tire tracks. Not our tire tracks. We'd been walking the ATVs along the edge of the road, not driving on the surface. These were in the center of the road, pressed into a thin layer of accumulated sediment over the crushed stone. Vehicle tracks. 2 axles, narrow wheelbase. Something small. A Jeep, maybe, or an old Forest Service patrol vehicle. I crouched beside the nearest print. The tread pattern was simple, a bar lug design common on older bias-ply tires, the kind of tire you'd find on government vehicles in the 1960s and 70s. The edges of the impressions were crisp. No leaf litter in the tracks, no debris, no algae or moss growing in the depressions. These tracks had not been here for 30 years. They looked like they'd been made recently. Days, maybe, weeks at most. The same freshness I'd noticed in the scratched message on the stone. Ellis. He was already beside me. He saw the tracks and went very still. "Those are vintage tread," he said quietly. "Nobody runs bias-ply bar lugs anymore. You can't even buy them." Could someone have old tires on a restored vehicle? Could they? Sure. Could they also drive that vehicle through a locked gate on a road that doesn't exist for the first mile? Cross a bridge that isn't there? And leave tracks on a section of road that hasn't been accessible to vehicles in 3 decades? He stood up. No, they couldn't. The tire tracks continued along the road's surface for approximately 300 feet, rounding the curve and continuing south along the traverse. We followed them on foot, walking beside the tracks rather than on them, the way you walk beside footprints at a crime scene. The tracks were consistent, same tread, same wheelbase, same depth of impression throughout. The vehicle had been traveling at a steady, moderate speed. No acceleration marks, no braking, no swerving. A routine drive down a road. At station 235 plus 00, the tracks ended. Not because the road ended, the road continued, visible and intact, curving further south. The tracks simply stopped. One moment they were there, clear and defined in the sediment, and the next they weren't. The road surface beyond the last track impression was undisturbed. No turnout, no turnaround, no place where a vehicle could have left the road. The terrain on both sides was steep cut slope above, retaining wall and drop below. There was nowhere to go. The vehicle had been driving south along the road, and then it had stopped being there, like the road sections, like the survey tags on the trees, present, then absent. I stood at the last track impression and looked south along the empty road. The alignment stretched ahead, curving gently through dappled shade, quiet and well-built and impossible. A road from 1962 with tire tracks from last week and no vehicle at either end. Ellis was on his hands and knees, examining the final track. No deceleration, he said. No weight transfer. The tire didn't slow down, didn't stop, didn't turn. The impression is uniform right to the end, and then it just... He brushed the surface ahead of the last mark. Clean, crushed stone. It just isn't. I photographed the tracks thoroughly, overall context shots, close-ups of the tread pattern, measurements of the wheelbase and track width. GPS marked the start and end points. Then I sat on the retaining wall and pulled out the road plan. Station 235 plus 00. The plan showed this section as a tangent traverse along the mountainside. Nothing special. No intersections, no pullouts, no structures. Just road continuing south. But the survey tags we'd found at the creek, the ones stacked on the stone, had included station numbers further ahead. 280 plus 00. 310 plus 00. 345 plus 00. 390 plus 00. 410 plus 00. 440 plus 00. All in the missing sections. All marking places where the road wasn't. I rechecked Ellis's notebook, where he'd been mapping the present and absent sections. From the creek crossing to our current position, the road was present, fully built. The first absent section, based on the pattern we'd observed, should start somewhere between here and station 280 plus 00. We keep going, I said. Ellis stood up slowly. His knees popped. He looked at the tire tracks behind us, then at the empty road ahead. I've been thinking about the Galt closure, he said. 6 days from recommendation to approval. You said that was fast. Fastest I've ever seen. What if Galt didn't just recommend closure? What if he recommended something stronger, decommissioning, demolition, full removal, and they compromised on closure? Why would he recommend demolition of a functioning road? Why would someone scratch a message telling us not to complete the survey? He had me there. We mounted the ATVs and continued south. The road held for another quarter mile. The retaining wall gave way to a natural bench in the terrain where the slope moderated, and the alignment straightened into a long tangent that followed the contour with minimal earthwork. The forest here was tall, mature oaks and hickories, with an open, park-like understory that let us see a considerable distance through the woods. This was the most pleasant section of road we'd encountered. Sunlight actually reached the surface, warming the crushed stone, drawing a faint herbal smell from the vegetation at the road's edge. At station 265 plus 00, I noticed something off the road's uphill side. A rectangular depression in the forest floor, roughly 4 feet by 8 feet, oriented with its long axis perpendicular to the road. The depression was about 10 inches deep, with sharply defined edges that hadn't been smoothed by erosion. Leaf litter had accumulated in the bottom, but the walls were clean and vertical. I stopped and examined it. Ellis joined me. Excavation, he said immediately. Someone dug here a long time ago, based on the leaf accumulation, but the edges are too clean for a natural depression. There was a second one, 30 feet further along the road. Same dimensions, same orientation, same depth. And a third, another 30 feet beyond that. All three were spaced evenly, all the same size, all on the uphill side of the road. Graves? I said it before I could stop myself, and immediately wished I hadn't. Because once the word was in the air, the depressions looked exactly like graves. Ellis was quiet for a moment. They could be equipment pits, borrow pits, post holes for a fence or barricade. Lots of things leave rectangular depressions. At regular intervals, same size, aligned to the road. Graves aren't usually perpendicular to roads, and they're usually deeper than 10 inches. He was right. I was letting the atmosphere get ahead of the evidence. The depressions were unusual, worth documenting, but not necessarily sinister. I photographed them, noted the dimensions and spacing, and we moved on. But at station 270+00, we found a fourth depression. This one was different. It was the same dimensions and orientation as the others, but it wasn't empty. At the bottom, visible through the leaf litter, was a layer of that same careful stonework we'd seen at the culvert outlet of flat stones fitted together with their smooth faces up, creating a sealed surface, a floor or a lid. Ellis saw it and stopped walking. He didn't approach. He stood about 10 feet away, looking at the stone surface at the bottom of the depression, and I could see him weighing something. "I don't want to dig that up," he said. "I wasn't going to suggest it." "Good." He was still staring at it. "Because whatever is under there, it's not in our scope of work. We're here to assess road conditions, not archaeology, not whatever this is." He was right about the scope. He was wrong about the clarity of the boundary. Everything we'd encountered was outside our scope. The building, the tags, the messages, the tire tracks. If we limited ourselves to assessing road conditions, we'd file a report that said road exists in discontinuous segments, recommend further study, and the regional office would send someone else, and that someone else would stand where we were standing and face the same questions we were facing. But I let it go. We documented the depression from above photographs, GPS measurements, and continued south without disturbing the stonework. At station 280+00, the road vanished. Same pattern, same abruptness. One step on engineered surface, next step on undisturbed forest floor. The cut slope healed into natural terrain. The retaining wall ended. The crushed stone gave way to loam and leaf litter. Station 280+00, one of the numbers on the survey tags. A missing section, marked in advance by someone or something that knew exactly where the road would stop existing. We pushed through the absent section on foot, following the alignment on the GPS where no road existed on the ground. The terrain was moderate. A gentle side hill traverse through hardwood forest, exactly the kind of easy, low-impact section that should have survived longest. Instead, it was the section that was gone. The absent stretch lasted for 1,200 feet. At station 292+00, the road reappeared. We found another present section, shorter this time, maybe 500 feet of intact road before it vanished again at station 305+00. Then another absence. Then a brief resurgence at 320+00. The pattern was accelerating, the present sections getting shorter, the absent sections getting longer. Ellis's notebook page looked like static, the solid and broken lines compressing into a tighter and tighter rhythm. By early afternoon, we'd reached station 345+00, deep in the longest absent section yet. We were walking through unbroken forest, no road visible in any direction, navigating purely by GPS and compass. The terrain had steepened as the alignment approached the head of the drainage. and the forest had shifted to a denser mix of hemlock and rhododendron that reminded me of the narrows near our first camp. The air was cool again, that same 10-degree drop, and the silence was back, not the ordinary quiet of a forest in early afternoon, but that deeper silence I'd felt on both previous nights, the structural silence, the one that felt intentional. Ellis noticed it too. He'd stopped and was standing with his head slightly tilted, the way experienced field people stand when they're listening with their whole body rather than just their ears. "No birds," he said. He was right. Since entering the absent section, I hadn't heard a single bird call. No ovenbirds, no thrushes, no vireos. Nothing. The forest was alive. I could see insects, a spider web spanning a gap between two rhododendron branches, a millipede crossing a rock, but the birds had gone silent or gone elsewhere. "Barometric pressure change?" I offered. "Birds sometimes go quiet ahead of weather fronts." Ellis checked the sky through a gap in the canopy. Clear. No front approaching. The weather had been stable for 3 days, and the forecast called for continued fair conditions through the end of the week. "It's not weather," he said. We continued. The alignment crossed a small saddle at the head of the drainage and began descending into what the topo map showed as a narrow side hollow, a crease in the mountain with no name and no mapped stream. The vegetation thickened as we descended. The canopy closed. Light dropped. At station 370+00, I found another survey tag. This one wasn't stacked on a stone or sitting on a shelf. It was embedded in the trunk of a living red oak, about 4 feet off the ground, with the bark growing around it exactly the way the original markers had been when we first encountered them on day 1. The tag was half consumed by the bark, its edges gripped by years of growth. Stamp number 370+00. I checked the surrounding bark. The growth around the tag was extensive. 10, maybe 15 years of accumulation, judging by the depth of the embedded edges. This tag had been in this tree for well over a decade. But station 370+00 was one we hadn't reached yet on our survey. We were standing at it now for the first time, and the tag we'd found at the building station, 440+00, had disappeared from the shelf and could be anywhere. Were the tags we'd found at the creek also now embedded in trees at their respective stations, swallowed by bark growth that should have taken years? I didn't check. I'm not sure I wanted to know. What I did instead was something I'd been resisting since the first morning. I sat down on a rock, pulled out my field book, and drew a timeline. Not a professional document, a personal one. Every anomaly, every impossible observation, every piece of evidence that defied explanation, plotted in the order we'd encountered it. The markers removing themselves from trees, the building in impossible condition, the tag from a future station appearing in a structure miles from its location, the door opening overnight, the tag disappearing, the warm ground, the tone, the tire tracks that started and stopped without a vehicle, the depressions, the stonework, the accelerating pattern of present and absent road, the silence. Laid out in sequence, the pattern wasn't random. It was progressive. Whatever was happening along this road, alignment was increasing in frequency and intensity the further west we traveled. The anomalies were closer together. The absent sections were longer. The messages were more direct. And the road itself was behaving less like a physical structure and more like a record that was being edited. Sections deleted, evidence rearranged, survey markers migrating from one location to another, like footnotes in a document that someone was revising while we read it. Ellis had come to stand beside me. He looked at my timeline without speaking, then pointed at the far right end, where I'd written a question mark at station 440+00, the terminus we hadn't reached. "What do you think is out there?" he asked. "I don't know." "Best guess." "I don't guess in the field." "Indulge me." I capped my pen. "I think the road was built. All of it. 17 miles, gate to terminus, exactly as the plan describes. And I think something happened after it was built. Not decay, not failure, not decommission. Something else. Something that's been taking it apart piece by piece for 30 years. Or longer." "Taking it apart how?" "I don't have a how. I have a what. The road is being removed. Not destroyed, removed. As though it's being subtracted from the landscape. And whatever is doing, it knows we're here and is communicating with us, using the road's own infrastructure." Ellis was quiet for a long time. A minute, maybe more. The silence around us was total. "Then we should leave," he said. "If something is telling us not to be here and we don't understand what it is, the professional decision is to withdraw, report our findings, and recommend a team with better resources." It was the right call. By every measure of the professional decision model I'd followed for 30 years, observe, assess, evaluate risk, choose the safest option, Ellis was correct. We were two men with ATVs, a radio, and a scope of work that had been rendered meaningless by the reality on the ground. We had enough documentation to justify a withdrawal. Nobody would question it. But I was looking at my timeline, at the clean progression of it, at the way each anomaly built on the previous one like steps in a proof. And I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being led somewhere, or not into danger. The phenomenon, whatever it was, had shown no hostility. It had communicated. It had warned. It had demonstrated. But it hadn't harmed, hadn't threatened, hadn't blocked our path or damaged our equipment or done anything that a reasonable person would classify as aggressive. It was showing us something, and we hadn't yet seen what it was showing us. "One more day," I said. "We push to station 410+00 tomorrow. That's the last tag before the terminus. If we find what I think we'll find, another absent section, we document it and turn around. That gives us enough data to map the full pattern without reaching the endpoint. And if we find something else, then we deal with something else." Ellis looked at me the way he'd looked at me when I'd mentioned graves, with the expression of a man who knows he's being asked to trust someone else's judgment in a situation where his own judgment is saying something different. "One more day," he said. We made camp at station 375+00, in the narrow side hollow, on a flat spot between two hemlocks that gave us partial shelter from a breeze that had started coming down from the ridge. The evening was cooler than the previous two, low 50s, with a dampness that hinted at fog by morning. I built a fire more for comfort than warmth. The flames felt like company in a place that had too little of it. I radioed Vasquez at 6 o'clock, standard check-in. I told her we'd documented extensive road conditions and expected to begin our return in 2 days. She acknowledged without questions. The conversation lasted 45 seconds, routine, normal, the most normal thing that had happened all day. After the radio went back in my pack, Ellis asked me something I wasn't expecting. "Have you ever been on an assessment where you recommended against reopening?" "Twice. Once for a road in the Bitterroot that was too far gone structurally. Once for a trail in the Cascades that had been wiped out by a lahar." "Did you ever recommend against reopening for a reason you couldn't put in a report?" I understood what he was asking. "No. Every recommendation I've made has been based on documentable conditions." "And this one?" I thought about it carefully. This one, I'm going to recommend permanent decommissioning. Full closure, gate maintained. No public access. Based on what? We can't write "the road is disappearing itself" in a federal document. We don't have to. We've documented discontinuous construction, absent drainage structures, lack of safe driving surface for over 80% of the alignment, uncharted historical structure requiring cultural resource evaluation, and active geologic instability evidenced by subsurface thermal and acoustic anomalies. That's enough. That's more than enough. Ellis stared at me. Geologic instability. The warm ground, the subsonic tone. Geologic instability. You don't believe that? What I believe doesn't go in the report. What I can document does. And I can document enough to keep this road closed permanently without ever mentioning the things we can't explain. He was quiet for a while, absorbing that. The fire popped. A hemlock branch released a small shower of needles that caught the light on their way down. "Is that what Galt did?" he said softly. "Wrote structural degradation because he couldn't write what actually happened?" "I think it's possible." 2 pages, no photographs. Fastest closure in history. He shook his head slowly. He was scared. He saw something, and he closed the road, and he used the minimum number of words to make it happen because he didn't want to describe what he'd seen. I think that's possible too. And now we're here, 30 years later, seeing the same things, about to write the same kind of report. Different words, same lie. It wasn't a lie. It was a selection. Every field report is a selection. You include what's relevant, documentable, and defensible, and you leave out what isn't. The things we couldn't explain weren't defensible. Including them would undermine the credible findings and potentially delay the closure recommendation while the regional office tried to figure out whether their field team had lost their minds. But Ellis was right that it was a continuation. A chain of silence, link by link, Galt to us. And whoever came after us would face the same choice, unless we did something different. I didn't know what different looked like. Not yet. That night, the tone came again. Louder this time. Longer. It began around 1 in the morning and lasted for nearly 30 seconds, a sustained, resonant vibration that I felt in my teeth. The ground warmed beneath me. And this time, the warmth was accompanied by a faint luminescence. Not a glow, exactly more like a change in the quality of darkness. The air between the trees took on a faint amber cast, as though lit from below by something buried deep in the soil. It lasted as long as the tone lasted, and when the tone faded, the light faded with it. I was outside my tent before the tone ended. Ellis was already standing in the clearing, facing downhill, looking toward where the road alignment continued west. "Tell me you saw that," he said. "I saw it. The light. From below. From below." He turned to face me. His expression was unlike anything I'd seen from him. Not fear, not confusion, but something closer to grief. The expression of a man watching a belief he'd held his entire life become insufficient. That's not geologic instability. No. That's not a person. No. He sat down on the log by the dead fire. I sat across from him. We stayed that way for a few minutes, listening to the silence that had followed the tone, which was deeper and more complete than any silence I'd experienced in the field. "I'm not going to pretend I understand this," he said. "I'm not going to build another theory that doesn't hold. I'm an engineer. I build things that work because I understand the forces acting on them. I can't work with forces I don't understand." "You don't have to understand them. You just have to record them." Record them for who? Who's going to read our notes and believe any of this? Maybe nobody. Maybe that's not the point. He looked at me. Then what is? I thought about Galt again. His 2-page filing, his minimum words, his 30 years silence. I thought about the tags, the messages, the building with its impossible condition, the road that was being unmade while we walked it. The point is that we were here, I said. And we saw it, and we wrote it down. Whether anyone believes it or reads it or acts on it, we made the record. That's what we can do. Ellis rubbed his face with both hands. He was tired, not field tired, the kind of tired that comes from holding a world view together while evidence pulls at its seams. One more day, he said. That's what we agreed. That's what we agreed. He went back to his tent. I stayed outside for another hour, watching the dark spaces between the trees for any return of the amber light. It didn't come back. The silence held. Piercy Creek was too far below us to hear now, and the hollow we'd camped in was wrapped in a quiet so complete that I could hear the sound of dew forming on leaves, a faint, continuous whisper, like static from a radio tuned to a frequency where someone was almost speaking. We broke camp at first light. The fog I'd predicted had arrived overnight, filling the hollow with a cold white medium that reduced visibility to maybe 60 feet. The hemlocks above us disappeared into it, their trunks fading to gray silhouettes and then to nothing. Sound behaved differently in the fog, flattened, absorbed, stripped of the directional cues you rely on without realizing it. I could hear Ellis packing his gear, but the sound seemed to come from everywhere rather than from the specific location of his tent 12 feet away. We ate quickly and loaded the ATVs. I checked the GPS. Station 410+00 was roughly 3/4 of a mile ahead, following the alignment as it descended through the side hollow and contoured around the head of the main drainage. Moderate terrain, straightforward navigation. In normal conditions, we'd cover it in under 2 hours. These were not normal conditions, but the decision had been made. And I've learned over the years that revisiting a decision in the field, especially one made carefully the night before, is more dangerous than committing to it. Doubt is a luxury for base camp. In the field, you move. We walked the ATVs rather than riding them. The fog made the footing uncertain, and the terrain was side-sloped enough that a wheel catching a hidden root could send a machine downhill in a hurry. Ellis led. I followed, carrying the GPS in one hand and my field book in the other, stopping every 100 feet to mark our position and note conditions. The road was absent, had been since station 345+00. We were traveling through unbroken forest, following an alignment that existed only as a line on a plan and a track on a screen. The ground beneath us was soft, undisturbed, carpeted in the thick duff of decades of hemlock needle accumulation. No compaction, no gravel, no cut slopes. The road wasn't hidden here. It simply wasn't. At station 385+00, Ellis stopped. He held up a hand without turning around, a field gesture I recognized from decades of working with people in quiet places. It meant, stop, listen, don't speak. I stopped. I listened. The fog moved around us in slow currents, carrying with it a smell I hadn't noticed before. Mineral, like the inside of the building, but stronger, wetter. The smell of deep stone exposed to air for the first time. The smell you encounter at the mouth of a mine or the opening of a natural cave. Ancient air meeting the atmosphere, carrying the chemical signature of rock that hasn't seen sunlight in geological time. Do you smell that? Ellis said, barely above a whisper. Cave air. Coming from below us? I couldn't tell. The fog made directional assessment impossible. The smell was simply present, diffuse, as though the air itself had changed composition. We continued. The terrain leveled briefly as the alignment crossed a small bench in the hillside, and the fog thinned slightly, not enough to see distance, but enough to see the ground, 20 or 30 feet ahead with some clarity. The bench was maybe 50 yards wide, a natural flat in the otherwise continuous slope, and the forest on it was different from what surrounded it. The hemlocks gave way to a stand of trees I didn't immediately recognize. They were hardwoods, but not any species I could name at a glance. The bark was pale, almost white, with a smooth texture that reminded me of beech, but the form was wrong. These trees were columnar, branchless for the first 20 feet, with a canopy that started high and spread in a flat, umbrella-like crown. The trunks were perfectly straight and spaced with an evenness that looked planted rather than natural. I counted 11 of them, arranged in a rough oval on the bench, each one approximately 15 feet from its neighbors. I approached the nearest trunk and examined the bark. Smooth, cool to the touch. No lichen, no moss, no insect damage. I pressed my thumbnail into the surface and it left no mark. The wood beneath the bark was denser than any living hardwood I'd handled. I pulled out my knife and tried to scratch the surface. The blade skated across without biting. "These aren't from around here," Ellis said. He was standing in the center of the oval, turning slowly, looking up at the canopy. The flat crowns overlapped above us, creating a ceiling of pale green leaves that filtered the fog light into something aqueous and still. "I've worked in every forest type in the southern Appalachians. I don't know what these are." Neither did I. And I'd spent the better part of my career identifying trees across a dozen ecosystems. These had characteristics of several families. The bark suggested Fagaceae. The form suggested something tropical. The leaf shape, which I could barely make out high above us, looked palmate with deep lobes. But the combination didn't match anything in my experience or my memory of any field guide I'd studied. I collected a leaf that had fallen near the base of one trunk. It was large, maybe 10 inches across, and thick, almost succulent, with a waxy surface and a deep green color that was nearly black. The veins were prominent, raised on the underside, and arranged in a pattern I'd never seen. Radiating from the stem in perfectly symmetrical pairs, each vein exactly the same length and angle as its opposite. The symmetry was uncanny. Biological structures are never perfectly symmetric. There's always some variation, some asymmetry introduced by growth conditions, light exposure, or mechanical stress. This leaf looked manufactured. I sealed it in a plastic bag and put it in my pack. "Station 390+00, Ellis said, checking the GPS. He pointed ahead, through the oval of trees, to where the bench ended and the slope resumed its descent. "We're close." We left the tree stand and continued. The fog was lifting now as the morning warmed, pulling up off the ground in slow vertical columns that dissolved in the canopy. Visibility improved to 100 feet, then 200. The forest returned to recognizable species: hemlock, oak, rhododendron. The mineral smell faded, replaced by the normal organic scent of damp forest. At station 395+00, the road reappeared. It emerged from the forest floor the way it always did, abruptly, without transition. One step on undisturbed ground, the next on compacted crushed stone with a visible ditch line and a cut slope 4 feet high on the uphill side. The road surface here was in the best condition we'd seen anywhere on the alignment. Clean, firm, almost new-looking. The aggregate was sharp-edged, as though recently placed. The ditch line was clear of debris. A culvert at station 398+00 was not only present but appeared freshly installed. The corrugated metal was bright, showing none of the rust or patination that every other culvert on the alignment had exhibited. Ellis knelt beside the culvert and touched the metal. He pulled his hand back immediately. "It's warm," he said. I touched it. He was right. The metal was warm not from sun exposure, because the canopy here was dense and no direct sunlight reached the road surface. Warm from within. The same ground warmth we'd felt in the night, concentrated now in a specific structure, as though the culvert were conducting heat from somewhere below. The road continued. At station 400+00, we found the retaining wall the plan described a massive structure, 8 feet tall, constructed of cut stone blocks, fitted with a precision that exceeded anything the Forest Service would have specified for a backcountry road. The blocks were rectangular, uniform, and seated without mortar. The joints between them were so tight I couldn't fit my knife blade into the seams. This wasn't road construction. This was masonry of a quality I'd seen only in historical structures, courthouses, bridges, the kind of public works built to last centuries. Ellis examined the wall in silence. He ran his hands over the stone. He measured the block dimensions. He checked the wall's batter its slight backward lean designed to resist soil pressure from the uphill side. Everything was textbook. Everything was perfect. Too perfect. "This wasn't built by a road crew," he said. "No. I've seen CCC work, WPA work, Bureau of Public Roads work from the 30s and 40s. The best of it doesn't look like this. The block sizes are too uniform. The joints are too tight. The finish is too consistent." He stepped back and looked at the wall as a whole. "I don't know who built this." Station 405+00. The road widened. The cut slopes grew taller. The retaining wall continued, curving gently as the alignment swept around the head of the drainage in a long, smooth arc. The engineering was extraordinary, a sweeping mountain road built to a standard that didn't exist in the Forest Service's construction vocabulary. The surface was smooth. The drainage was flawless. The structural elements were overbuilt by a factor I couldn't estimate, because I had no frame of reference for what they were built to withstand. And then we reached station 410+00. The road opened into a clearing. Not a natural clearing, a constructed one. A flat, circular area, roughly 80 feet in diameter, carved into the mountainside with cut slopes rising 10 feet on 3 sides. The floor was paved. Not asphalt, not concrete stone. Flat, fitted stone blocks, the same material and quality as the retaining wall, laid in a radiating pattern that spiraled outward from the center of the circle like the growth rings of a tree. In the center of the circle, set flush with the stone surface, was a metal plate. Round, roughly 3 feet in diameter, dark iron or steel, heavily oxidized, with no visible bolts, hinges, or seams. It looked like a manhole cover, except that it was in the middle of a stone platform on a mountainside in the Nantahala National Forest, 7 miles from the nearest paved road, behind a gate that had been locked for 30 years. The fog had cleared entirely now. Mid-morning sunlight reached the clearing through a gap in the canopy created by the cut slopes, and the stone floor was warm where the light hit it. The air was still. No breeze, no birds, no insects. The silence here was absolute, not the structural silence of the hollow, but something beyond that. A silence that felt terminal, as though sound itself had reached its destination and stopped Ellis and I. stood at the edge of the clearing for a full minute without entering. We looked at the stone floor, the spiraling pattern, the metal plate in the center. We looked at each other. "This is it," I said. "This is what the road leads to. This isn't in the plan." No. This was never in any plan. Not Forest Service, not CCC, not anyone. He was gripping his notebook so hard, his knuckles were white. "This is something else entirely." I stepped onto the stone floor. It was solid underfoot, no give, no vibration, no warmth beyond what the sun provided. I walked toward the center slowly, watching the spiral pattern pass beneath my boots. The stonework was flawless. Each block was fitted to its neighbors with that same impossible precision. The spiral moved clockwise from the center, widening with each revolution, and I had the unsettling sense that I was walking along a record, a physical inscription, like the groove of a vinyl album etched into the mountain itself. The metal plate was set perfectly flush with the surrounding stone. Its surface was covered in a thin layer of oxidation that was uniform and undisturbed. No scratches, no tool marks, no attempt by anyone to open or lift it. Around its circumference, where the metal met the stone, there was no gap. The plate was sealed to the floor as though it had been cast in place. I knelt beside it and placed my palm flat on the metal. It was cold. Not cool cold. Aggressively, unnaturally cold, the way metal gets when exposed to temperatures far below freezing. In the morning sun, on a day in the low 60s, this plate was cold enough that I pulled my hand away after 3 seconds because the contact was becoming painful. "Don't touch it," I said to Ellis, who was approaching behind me. "What's wrong?" "It's freezing, well below ambient temperature, way below." He crouched beside me and held his hand an inch above the surface. "I can feel it. Cold air radiating up." He looked at me. "There's something below this. Something very cold. Something with a lot of thermal mass." I leaned close to the plate and listened. I don't know why. Instinct, maybe. Or the accumulated logic of 3 days of observations pointing downward, the subsurface warmth, the deep tone, the cave air, the luminescence from below. Everything had been pointing down since we'd arrived. Everything suggested that whatever was happening along Road 1141 originated beneath the surface, not on it. I pressed my ear to the stone floor beside the plate, close enough to feel the cold but not touching the metal itself. I heard something. Not the tone, not the resonant vibration from the previous nights. Something different. A rhythm. Irregular but purposeful, like a sequence being repeated. Short and long durations of sound, separated by pauses, not mechanical, organic. The rhythm had the quality of something alive, something breathing in a pattern that carried information. I listened for 30 seconds, memorizing what I could. Then I sat up and looked at Ellis. "There's a signal," I said, "coming from below the plate. A rhythmic sequence. It's not random. A signal. A pattern. Repeated intervals. Like a pulse code." Ellis sat down heavily on the stone floor. He put his notebook in his lap, opened it to a blank page, and looked at me. "I don't know what to do with that information," he said. "In 31 years of civil engineering, nobody has ever told me there's a coded signal coming from under a stone platform on a mountain road that's been erasing itself for 3 decades. He paused. "What do you want to do?" It was the question, the one I'd been approaching since the first morning, when the survey markers had left their trees. The one that every piece of evidence, every impossible observation, every message scratched into aluminum and stone had been building toward. What do you do when the investigation leads you to a door you have no tools to open and no framework to understand? I looked at the metal plate. Cold. Sealed. Silent now, or at least I could no longer hear the rhythm from where I sat. I looked at the stone floor, its spiral pattern, its impossible craftsmanship. I looked at the road behind us, stretching back toward the gate 17 miles away, existing and not existing in alternating segments, like a sentence with every other word removed. And I made my decision. We document everything. Photograph the clearing, the stonework, the plate. GPS coordinates, measurements, observations. Everything we can record without disturbing the site. Then we turn around and we go back. We don't open it. We don't open it. Ellis let out a breath I don't think he knew he'd been holding. Why? I stood up and looked around the clearing one more time. The sunlight was moving across the stone floor as the morning progressed, and the spiral pattern caught the light differently at different angles, creating the illusion of slow rotation. The trees at the edge of the clearing, normal trees, oaks and hemlocks, stood in a ring like witnesses. Because the messages told us not to complete the survey, and this is what they were protecting. Whatever is under that plate, whatever is producing the signal, whatever has been maintaining this road and unmaking it and communicating with us through tags and stones and ground warmth. It's not asking us to engage. It's asking us to leave it alone. I paused, and I think Galt understood that. I think he came here, or close to here, and he understood that the right response wasn't investigation. It was respect. Ellis closed his notebook. He looked at the plate for a long time. Then he stood up and nodded. Let's document and go. We spent 45 minutes in the clearing. I photographed every surface, every angle, every detail I could capture. Ellis measured the diameter of the circle, the height of the cut slopes, the dimensions of the stone blocks. He sketched the spiral pattern in his notebook. IGPS marked the plate's exact coordinates and recorded the temperature differential by holding my field thermometer at the plate surface and at the surrounding stone. The plate was 38 degrees below the ambient air temperature, nearly 40 degrees of differential with no visible refrigeration mechanism, no shade, no water, just a metal disc in a stone floor, radiating cold from a source we would never see. At the edge of the clearing, just before the road began its journey back east, I found one more survey tag. It was lying on the stone floor, face up, in the sunlight. Station 440+00, the terminus. The number matched the tag that had appeared in the building and then disappeared from the shelf. On the back, scratched in the same crude hand, "Thank you for stopping." I set the tag back where I'd found it. I did not take it with us. The walk back was long and quiet. We didn't ride the ATVs until we reached the wider sections of road on the east side of Hewitt Ridge, where the switchbacks provided enough constructed surface to drive safely. The pattern held in reverse road, appearing and disappearing, present and absent. The forest giving us the built sections, like checkpoints, and swallowing the rest. We camped that night near the stream crossing, where we'd found the stacked tags. The tags were gone. The stone was bare. The scratched message. The road remembers you was still visible in the rock, but fainter now, as though it too was being reclaimed. Ellis slept through the night for the first time since we'd started. I stayed awake for a while, listening. The tone came once, very briefly 2 seconds, barely audible, more feeling than sound. A pulse, an acknowledgement. Then it stopped and the normal sounds of the forest returned. Frogs, insects, an owl, the creek. We reached the gate at 3 in the afternoon the next day. The road behind us the first mile, the section that had been completely absent on our way in, was still absent. Unbuilt, untouched, forest floor where a road had supposedly been. But the gate was there. Steel, concrete, bolted, real. I replaced the lock. Ellis loaded the ATVs onto the trailer. We drove to the ranger station in silence. The report I filed ran 23 pages. It documented discontinuous road construction inconsistent with the approved road plan, absence of critical drainage structures in multiple sections, presence of an uncharted historical structure requiring cultural resource evaluation, evidence of subsurface geothermal and acoustic anomalies suggesting active geologic instability, and a recommendation for permanent decommissioning of Forest Development Road 1141 with no public access. The recommendation was approved in 9 days. Fast, but not Galt fast. The road was permanently decommissioned. The gate stayed. The file was closed. The leaf that I'd collected from the unidentified tree was sent to the regional botanist and then to a university lab in Raleigh. The report that came back said the leaf could not be identified to any known genus. The cellular structure was consistent with a vascular plant, but the tissue density, the vein symmetry, and several chemical markers were outside the range of any cataloged species. The lab asked where I'd collected it. I gave them the GPS coordinates. As far as I know, nobody went to check. Ellis retired 18 months later. He called me once, about a year after the assessment, to ask whether I'd included the tire tracks in the report. I had. Described as evidence of historical vehicle access inconsistent with closure timeline, suggesting possible unauthorized entry prior to current survey period. Clean, professional. True enough? And the plate, he asked. Described as an unidentified metal feature requiring further investigation by qualified specialists. Has anyone investigated? Not that I've been told. He was quiet for a moment. I dream about those trees sometimes. The white ones, in the oval. So do I. What do you think they are? I didn't have an answer for him then, and I don't now. I've thought about it more than I'd like to admit. The trees, the plate, the signal beneath it, the road that unmade itself in sections like a story being redacted. I've thought about Galt's 2-page filing and whether he heard the same tone, felt the same ground warmth, stood in the same clearing, and made the same choice. I think he did. I think the road showed him what it showed us. And he did what we did. He documented what he could, closed what he could close, and lived with what he couldn't explain. 2 pages, minimum words. Not because he was scared, though he may have been. Because there are things the professional vocabulary doesn't accommodate. And rather than force inadequate language around an experience that exceeds it, sometimes the most honest thing you can do is say as little as possible and trust that the record, however incomplete, is better than nothing. Road 1141 is still gated, still closed. The forest is still growing over whatever was built there, still swallowing the engineered sections the way it swallowed the absent ones, slowly, patiently, with the same inexorable appetite that takes everything eventually. But I don't think everything under that mountain is patient. I think the signal is still pulsing beneath that stone platform. I think the spiral is still turning. I think the road remembers everyone who walked it. The way the rings of a tree remember every year, silently, structurally, in a language written in material rather than words. I filed my report. I recommended closure. The closure was approved. The file was sealed and archived. And somewhere in the Nantahala, behind a brown steel gate on a County 2-lane 4 miles south of Aquone, a road that doesn't entirely exist still leads to a door that nobody has opened. I made sure of that. I'm not certain it was the right decision, but I am certain it was the honest one.